Hello and welcome back to The Green Recovery, brought to you by Project Syndicate. I'm Jo Coburn. In a little over an hour, we'll be hearing from Ethiopian Prime Minister and winner of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize, Abiy Ahmed, who will be in conversation with Bertrand Badre, CEO and founder of Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. But before that, our fourth and final session is Closing the Circuit. A look at energy and whether there really is a path towards a greener, more sustainable future. In a few moments, former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd will be making the opening remarks. But first, let's meet our panel of highly accomplished experts from around the world who'll be shedding light on the global challenges and solutions on this vital issue. Let's start with Jules Kortenhorst, is the CEO of the Rocky Mountain Institute, a non-profit think tank which aims to help companies, communities and institutions to make the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. Laurence Toubiana is CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Previously, she served as France's climate change ambassador and is recognised as one of the key architects of the Paris Agreement. José Antonio González Anaya is the former Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico and the former CEO of Pemex, Mexico's national petrol and oil company. Omran Al-Kawari is the CEO of Qatar Foundation International. He previously worked in various gas and oil companies, including Qatar Gas, Qatar Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Green Gulf and Enterprise Qatar. But first, let's remind ourselves of what's at stake. Now, if you'd like to join the conversation or help spread the word, please do get involved on social media using the hashtag #TheGreenRecovery. Now, though, here's Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia.
Well, folks, here we are in the midst of the COVID crisis and the great global recession which has followed it. It's one giant cluster F, to use the technical macroeconomic term. The key question for those of us concerned about the planet is what do we do to engender a genuine green economic recovery? The energy sector generates 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we tackle the energy sector, then we're going to make a huge impact in terms of our ability to keep global temperature increases within 1.5 degrees centigrade. There's some encouraging news. Number one is candidate Biden's promise that the United States would produce a decarbonised national electricity grid by 2035. And just to put that into its context, no American state at this stage has that commitment. Candidate Biden has also committed to the United States being net carbon neutral by 2050. These two undertakings form an enormous basis upon which we can see a clean energy revolution across the United States. Of course, globally, it ain't all as rosy as that. To put that into context, that's bigger than the current entire fleet of such stations within the United States. There are some positive things happening in China as well. They're making moves towards a carbon price. We also see initiatives in terms of electric vehicles. We see electrical vehicle charging stations across the country. If Biden's elected, whatever may happen in the rest of the US-China relationship, it is in the planet's interest that China and the United States resume collaboration on combined climate change action. Governments can make a difference. I was Prime Minister of Australia during the global financial crisis, and we made 3 big decisions as far as the environment were concerned. We legislated for a mandatory renewable energy target of 20% of Australian energy supply by 2020. And guess what? That's come in on time. We're now at 22% renewable in this country, having started with only 4. We also undertook what we call the Energy Efficient Homes program, insulation into houses needing either heating or cooling, and that resulted in insulation in 20% of the nation's housing stock. We subsidised solar panels on about 20% of the nation's housing stock as well. These measures in aggregate helped contribute to a 10% real reduction in Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. So turning to the future and a global green economic recovery, I'd suggest the following steps. Number 1, targeted investments in renewable energy projects. Number 2, invest in large-scale energy infrastructure projects which of themselves transform the nature of the stationary energy sector. 3, invest in the decommissioning of existing coal-fired power stations which are ready for the scrap heap anyway. 4, invest again in R&D, because unless that happens, we're not dealing effectively with the big other renewable energy options and energy efficiency options for the future. I believe we can do that and do it in a way which actually generates not just good stuff for the environment and the planet, but generates a bunch of jobs and contributes to economic recovery at the same time. It makes this less of a cluster F than it would otherwise be. Good to be with you.
So that was Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. Now in about half an hour, we'll be hearing questions from editors and journalists from around the world. But now it is time to open up our discussion about greener energy. And Laurence, I'd like to start with you because you were strongly involved with drafting the Paris agreements. When you look at the energy sector today, do you feel the world is likely to meet the targets you devised?
We have a mixed picture. On one side, of course, we still have, as Kevin just said, that the amount of fossil fuel in the global economy is very high, and China and other countries are still investing, Australia, still investing in coal-based power plants. But at the same time, you see in many other countries, I look at Europe, for example, going down on the coal. And finally, there is a huge number of coal-based power plants that have been closed during the last 5 years. So there is clearly a move to renewable energies. There is clearly a move that coal is over as a stranded asset now. But at the same time, of course, it's too slow, meaning I think the direction of travel is right.
Right.
The problem is that it's just too slow because we have started so late to address the question of fossil fuels. Another good signal, which I feel optimistic with, is that some oil companies, I'm looking at BP, for example, or is now seeing its future in renewable energy and not in drilling more oil. So there are these good signs,
right.
But really the run against time.
Omran, the issue of BP, we've heard this phrase peak oil. Do you think we've reached that? Certainly Bernard Looney seemed to think so.
Yeah, I think peak demand, I believe, is what BP is saying. And it's a very interesting question. I think it's something that 5 years ago wasn't even something we'd consider. But I think the point, just to carry on these companies like BP and taking on these certain kind of goals to become net zero companies is very substantial. There's no way we can reach the Paris Agreement without energy companies at least doing their part. And something where, in the past we hear about energy companies focusing on the extraction process, being efficient and lean. But now finally, I think with pressure from the financial industry, from policymakers and the populations around the world, there's pressure for companies to go and look at the entire emissions, so scope 3 emissions, if you want to be more technical. And that will really change things because it will drive up investment in low carbon technology. It will also speed up innovation in solutions where you have to really decarbonize the harder parts of the chain. and that will really help support the Paris Agreement.
Jose Antonio, is there a problem, though, with countries who sign up to these global agreements and then don't necessarily keep to them? I mean, in the last few years, we've seen the discovery of huge amounts of gas under the eastern Mediterranean, estimated to be enough to power the entire United States for over a decade. So is it a surprise to you that it's become so hotly contested, with Turkey even dispatching naval vessels to flank a drilling ship there? Doesn't that, in a way, indicate the point that, yes, they'll sign up, but they won't necessarily keep to those commitments?
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems with when we talk about these things is we need to send the right price signals, and that may sound a bit esoteric, but you know, people love to talk about carbon taxes and everything, and then we ask ourselves, which is your question, why don't we do them? And the answer is it's unpopular. You know, it sounds good to have a carbon tax until you have to pay more gasoline for your car, or more gasoline, or pay more for an airplane ticket, or pay more for all of your shipping costs. So as long as we don't have the right price signals, then all of this becomes very difficult to do. I think we're facing an interesting area, which is the price of oil has fallen because of the pandemic. So now it's the time to put in carbon taxes on fuels. And we see that in Latin America, where, you know, when you eliminate the fuel subsidies, all kinds of riots happen. But today, the price of oil has fallen. Now it's the time not to let the price of gasoline fall.
Right. So do you agree, Jules, that this is a prime time to take that sort of action in the midst of the pandemic?
A price on carbon has for the longest time been one of the crucial policy measures that pretty much every economist agrees on is necessary. But there's some good news even in the absence of a price on carbon, particularly in the electricity sector, but I would say also in mobility. We can now see that the renewable, sustainable energy solutions of the future are more cost competitive than fossil fuels. And at the moment that on a standalone basis, without a price on carbon, without subsidies, the economics flip, that's also when the movement starts to accelerate. We've seen it here in the United States quite significantly, where new wind and solar is more cost effective than existing coal plants. And as a result, the number of coal plants in the United States that has been closed down over the 4 years under the Trump administration is actually higher than the number of coal plants that were shut down during 8 years of Obama. So the pace is accelerating there because the economics has flipped. And if you then put a price on carbon on top of that, you further drive that transition. So yes, the policy measure is crucial, but we should not ignore the fact that in some sectors of the energy economy, we can move forward because the economics have already shifted.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Jules, because we're going to show you and everyone watching a graph taking in some of what you said and about energy consumption over the years. This is actually looking at energy consumption by source over the last 50 years. Coal, oil and gas, as you can see, have grown enormously, while renewables have failed to keep up, and that's despite, as you say, the cost coming down. Why?
Fundamental point, this transition is only just now starting to happen. For the longest time, the investments in solar and in wind were motivated by subsidies and a long-term outlook that in due course these technologies could compete. It is only just in the last couple of years that we've seen this very significant shift where, like I said, new solar plants, new wind sites can outcompete existing coal plants, and soon will even be outcompeting existing gas plants.
Right.
That completely, dramatically changes the dynamic. So the curves that you showed, which were so flat for such a long time at the bottom of that graph, are about to go steep up when the economics for everybody clearly to see become differently.
Right. Laurence, do you agree that that transformation is going to happen? Is there still a problem, though, with reliability when it comes to renewables?
First, I think Julie is right. It's just happening now. It's recent, and the investment is finally very recent. So when you look 50 years in this period, of course, you don't see the evolution. When you look at the 10 last year, then you see the evolution very clearly. So that's one. Second, if you want people to not to use oil or gas and to have something else, you have to offer the alternative, and they are ready and they are available. And I do see now the progress, and that's true, for example, for electric vehicle. If you want to shift from combustion engine to electric vehicle, you have to have the charging system in place. So the price is good and important, but the infrastructure is absolutely key. What I do think now is that what we see is the acceleration of this path, again, because what Jules said, the prices are going down. But now the problem is that in the recovery phase we are in, which is the topic of this panel, we have to make sure that we are not maintaining stranded asset and old activities while we should be investing even more, because what I said in the beginning, we are losing the race against time. So that's a key moment to decide to take the right decisions.
Right, Omran, you've been nodding your head listening to the other two guests, but would you be prepared to withdraw in the way that Laurence is talking about some traditional forms of energy in order to boost even further the use of renewables?
I think we don't have the really luxury. I think all solutions need to be looked at, but I do agree with both speakers that energy transition is happening. And it takes a long time. But why this energy transition is different than previous ones, which tend to happen every 100 years or so, is that this one is what we call a purposive one. You know, there's a reason why this is happening, and it's being accelerated. We have a carbon budget we have to meet. We have climate change, and I think that will put pressure and accelerate things a lot. And then to add on top of that, you know, the costs of renewables and low carbon electricity is really coming down rapidly, and we see. By 2050, 50% of all power consumption by some estimates will be electrified, and mostly by low carbon, which is great news. But that still leaves a question about the other 50%. And that's where we touch on some of these issues, you know, stranded assets potentially. But also, you know, how do you address the other 50%? In the meantime, I think power sector in general is something that we see a pathway, as mentioned by Jules. Renewables have come down, the cost of storage has come down, battery technology has come down dramatically, 80% in the last 8 years or so. But what happens to the harder to, what they call harder to abate sectors, or the hard to decarbonize sectors? And that's why you need to, from now on, start thinking about those through innovation and leadership in research and development, and make sure you have the incentive in place to start looking at, you know, large scale hydrogen production or carbon capture if you have to use it, or even negative emission technologies. I think that's going to be where the focus needs to be, in my opinion, in the next 10 years. And that will definitely touch on hard decisions about what do you do about coal plants. I mean, Asia definitely has coal plants that are being decommissioned, but I think over 60% of the coal plants that are in China or India are built in the last 20 years. That's going to be a big challenge economically.
Jose Antonio, what do you say?
Well, I mean, I agree with what's been said, and I don't want, you know, I agree with all of the points that have been made. But I'm sorry to come back to this. There are still regions in the world where, like Latin America, like the Middle East, we subsidize fossil fuels. We have to eliminate these subsidies. And my point, I understand the problems with implementing carbon taxes, but subsidizing fuels, gasoline, diesels, jet fuels, it just, to me, it doesn't make any sense, and we still do so. You know, in Latin America, to give you an idea, it's 3% of government revenues, the amount of subsidies that we have. My idea is that in the Middle East, it's even higher. The time to eliminate these subsidies is now, because the price of oil has fallen. So instead of letting the prices of fuels come down, you just, you know, put a tax in there, and you eliminate the political costs of increasing the prices of fossil fuels. So I think it's important. It's not popular. It's not, you know, good news, but it's important to do, because otherwise, if we believe, and I believe that we're reaching peak demand in some of these fossil fuels, the prices of these things are going to fall. So what's been said about, you know, renewables becoming more and more competitive is true, But if the price of oil falls, it's going to be harder and harder to do as well. So there's an equilibrium here that one has to take into account. That's my only point, although I agree with what's been said, of course.
Right, but before we move on, because I want to pick up on your point, Jose Antonio, in terms of different parts of the world using different forms of energy, particularly fossil fuels. But listening to that issue about if the oil price, you know, as it has fallen, how difficult is it going to be to wean people off if it's also cheap, Jules?
Well, there is no doubt that subsidies on fossil fuels are the absolute opposite of what needs to happen. And I completely agree with Jose Antonio that now is the time for countries to step back from subsidizing fossil fuels. By the way, that's not just, we often think about that as something that foremost is a challenge for emerging economies. But here in the United States, the subsidies for exploration and production for the upstream part of the energy system are very significant. So those need to be eliminated. The one thing that gives me hope is that although that needs to happen, and although policy is incredibly important, we are also seeing momentum from the private sector. And we are seeing momentum because the economics are shifting so clearly, and companies that in the past would never have acknowledged this accelerating shift are now joining the bandwagon. BP,
Okay.
It was already mentioned, a good example there, announcing that they will reduce their own production of oil and gas by 40% over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And that sort of approximates what is necessary for a 1.5 degree world. So yes, we need the policies, but my story is often about the private sector.
All right, will you stick with that story? Now, don't forget to join the conversation and help share the word. Please do get involved on social media using the hashtag #TheGreenRecovery. Omran, I'm going to ask you to look at this graph along with everybody else because it's about energy consumption, as I mentioned, in different parts of the world. And as you can see, it's levelled off in the West, but there has been enormous growth in the Asia-Pacific region, driven by the most incredible growth of human prosperity in history. Would it have been possible, that growth, without a huge increase in CO2? And what can be done to stop it rising further?
I mean, that's probably hard to say that it would have been possible in the other way. I think, you know, the awareness of climate change, of course, existed in a long time in many, in academia in many areas, but I think companies, you know, met the demand and it is what it is. Going forward, though, I think definitely a lot can be mitigated. I think going forward, there has to be some strong action on making sure you decarbonize the power sector immediately. And that may require some tough decisions like closing coal plants, but also may require some maybe unpopular decisions from an environmental perspective, like nuclear. You know, you look at nuclear, if we had more time, and if we had other options, you know, there are options that exist in terms of using low carbon renewables and offshore wind and solar, of course, and regular wind, but we don't have the time to meet the scale needed. And really, we're talking about India and China when we're talking about Asia and the rest of the world. India and China stand differently, and even the IPCC recognized that there's a need for 2.5 increase in nuclear in that part of the world just to be able to meet the scale. So what I'm saying is, going forward, yes, it is possible, but there will be some tough decisions and maybe not ones that work in Europe or in the US. And maybe, you know, it's a very different part of the world. Same, but if you go to like Africa, for example, you know, nuclear doesn't make sense. It's mostly rural, and there's ways to meet that. So what I'm getting at is, it is possible, but it will require tough decisions, and it will require leadership, international leadership. I mean, if you're going to shut down these coal plants, who will how will that be managed economically?
Okay, well, we'll talk about...
And there's also other issues related to security of supply and so on we can talk about, which will have to be addressed.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the nuclear sort of part of the mix in just a moment. But Laurence, I want you to respond, because on that graph, we saw Europe's energy consumption flatline from around the mid-80s. How can Europe go further and substantially reduce its energy consumption?
I think the plan is, on the one, really to increase enormously the amount of energy consumed. All the scenario for getting to net zero by 2050 implies a reduction of 50% of the energy consumption. How is this possible? Really gaining and inventing and innovating in energy efficiency. The main source of energy consumption in Europe now are from two sectors, mainly transport and buildings. On buildings, really, we are lagging behind because we have a stock of capital built that we have to refit. And this is coming now. The Green Deal in Europe, this big Green Pact, is about really hundreds of millions and billions would be thrown out refitting building as a major source of employment and a major source of economy efficiency. The second one, of course, is the transport sector. And you know, when you go from a combustion engine to electric transport, you want a lot of energy, and the consumption of energy of electricity is much lower. So that's one of the solutions. The other one, of course, is a change in the behaviors and the way we live. A part of the energy, for example, is consumed through agriculture, and agriculture is about the food chain as well. So there is multiple, of course, it's not simple, it's no silver bullet, but there is different sectors that can use much less energy. But then, of course, the problem is still the source of energy. And I don't want to reopen the nuclear discussion, but the problem is really the competitiveness of nuclear, which is, of course, a pool of concentrated energy. But the problem is, for the moment, the unit cost of any kilowatt or megawatt of nuclear is still very expensive for many reasons, including safety.
Yes.
So, but now hydrogen is coming in, which could be a concentrated source of energy, like we see, for example, the whole movement of the steel industry now really seeing a zero carbon process possible because of hydrogen, of course, which you have to produce out of some source of electricity anyway.
Yeah.
So I think there are multiple ways where energy is not just a unique way to think about we need more oil or more gas or more biomass.
Jose Antonio, can I go back to this link, though, that we discussed with Omran, which is, can the Global South really reduce its levels of poverty without increasing energy consumption? Isn't that link quite clear? And is it fair to ask them to do so?
I mean, I think you're going to increase the level of energy consumption, but there are ways to feed this energy. And I think what we can do is promote the development of cleaner energies in the process of growth. And we've seen that happening in different areas of the world. But, you know, I come back, I guess I'm too much of an economist, I come back to pricing. If you subsidize fossil fuels, well, you're going to invest in fossil fuels. If you don't subsidize R&D in renewables, I'll give you a couple of examples. The only country in Latin America that has prices of gasoline in the level of Europe is Uruguay. Everybody else is much lower, and most of us are subsidizing. But some of us, most countries in Latin America, have import tariffs on solar panels. Well, you're not going to have solar panels if you have 20% import tariffs on the solar panels. You're not going to import them. So there are lots of policies that you can do to create the energy so you can grow. So I'm not a big fan of this, growth versus energy consumption debate. I think you can get the energy, you can get the growth, but at the same time, you can put the incentives to have lower carbon incentive growth. And that I think we can do.
Right, so what is the obstacle in your mind then political? Is it just that these things aren't palatable at the moment, that they haven't happened, because you make it sound so plausible and straightforward?
Well, I think there was a key to your question is at the moment. I think now is the moment. For all the wrong reasons, we have a chance to put the right policies in place. And some of these, I'm not sure if it's political or just inertia that we like to say, it's just gasoline is cheap, so you can take your car wherever you want. Or somebody has a small plant of solar panels that is not efficient in one of our countries, so we protect it. Well, that's not very sound, ecological or economical reasoning to put 20% tariffs on solar panels or on wind equipment, etc.
Right, but what about then the infrastructure question, Jules? Because Laurence has brought up a couple of times transport and, moves to electric vehicles. But if the infrastructure isn't there in countries and regions across the world, people aren't going to do that. You have to have the infrastructure first, don't you? And the companies that you probably deal with might invest and might go for these things if they were confident that the infrastructure was already in place.
absolutely crucial point, Joe. We have to make massive investments in the renewable and clean energy infrastructure of the future, and now is the time. We all know that as a result of this horrible pandemic, we're going to have to boost our economies around the world with stimulus measures. And analysis after analysis shows that if you direct those stimulus measures to the energy solutions of the future, you create more jobs, you strengthen the competitiveness of your economy, and of course you address the issues of climate change and health. So this is really a pivotal moment where in laying out the infrastructure investment plans for the next decade, governments have to make the right decision. Bailing out fossil fuel companies makes absolutely no sense. Investing in the infrastructure of the future is the right idea. Building new coal plants is really stupid. You're building the stranded assets of the future. Investing in wind and solar is the right decision. I can go on and on. It's so obvious, these choices. And I've seen over the last couple of months economists around the world congregating around this idea that the stimulus that gets us out of the pandemic economic crisis has to be a green stimulus. I think governments really have to follow on that advice. And by the way, an inspirational example in Europe. I mean, the Green Deal that the European Commission is pushing is the sort of program that we need around the world.
Well, Jules, I'm going to actually stick with your point, in fact, what all of you have been saying, which is about the cost of renewables. Let's have a look at it again on this graph, because you can see that today the cheapest energy sources in many countries around the world are now renewables. So, again, if that's the case, you say it's stupid, but why are people still commissioning fossil fuels?
There is inertia in the business system, and there is politics. And let's be honest, not all of the energy decisions are made purely on the basis of economics. Politics plays a big factor. Just look here at the United States. 4 years ago, the incoming administration said they were going to save the coal industry. Well, the reality is that the number of coal plants that gets closed down has accelerated here in the United States because the politics didn't work. But it is a slow process if politicians are pulling in the wrong direction. So I think it's very obvious that we need to get the message out much more clearly that anybody who invests in fossil infrastructure is essentially investing in stranded assets of tomorrow. And these are silly decisions. Same in China, building new coal-fired power capacity. When the Chinese existing coal-fired power fleet operates at less than 50% capacity utilization is a waste.
Right.
I wonder, Laurence agrees, but...
Well, let me go to Laurence. I'm going to come to you, Omran, in just a moment. But Laurence, you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, because Jules is very right. Why this inertia? Why is really the lock-in into something which is irrational from the economic point of view? It's the politics. It's the politics of the state-owned enterprise in many countries. It's a politics of stranded asset people in government are afraid of killing, because what do you do with this capital which will be destroyed? And you see, everything is about expectations. If now the expectation of government and business and investors are saying, well, coal is dead, oil will come soon, you will see the shift, and then the government will be probably a little bit more courageous to deal with that. But that costs money. When you close a power plant, you have to compensate. Electricity company, for example, in Germany are asking now, even if they are non-profitable, just to ask for more money to stay or even to close down. So that's a political economy issue. I do think that the energy issue these days is mainly about political economy. And they have to find a compromise to buy the stranded asset out and just to make the space for the more profitable ones to come in.
Right, well, that's true, isn't it, Omran? Because, I mean, there are examples all over the world, but if you just take the tensions between Russia and Saudi Arabia, how fossil fuels still play a huge part in international diplomacy.
No, I fully agree with, mostly agree, actually, with everything I heard, but especially what Laurence just said. I mean, one point to think about is obviously the international oil companies, Shell, Total, Exxon, they get a lot of attention, rightfully so, because they own large portfolios and they have great technologies and so on. and they have pressure to transition, but they really just represent a small portion of the reserves. And the majority of reserves, a large, significant majority of reserves are still national oil companies. And those national oil companies, as mentioned, they have a responsibility or a duty to fund their governments in many cases, almost entirely. And the political economy aspect of it is how are those companies structurally going to stop operating? They may be more efficient, and they may be more progressive and look towards, things like carbon capture and maybe blue hydrogen, and transition fuel, and become more focused on gas. But at the end of the day, they have an obligation to extract, and that's where the challenge is. That's where it's hard. And international companies, oil companies and banks have a role because they're partners in those. A lot of times these companies now are sophisticated enough that they don't need any partners. And at the same time, you also have developing countries that are, hoping to monetize and grow their economies, and you're telling them not to keep it on the ground. So it is, it makes sense. The economics are making sense in a lot of sectors. On paper, it makes a lot of sense that fossil fuels should not be used in many areas. But when you look at the political economy aspect, as Laurent said, it's much more complicated, and it affects a lot more people than we think it does, as I mentioned, national oil companies.
Do you accept that, Jose Antonio? I know you want to look at it all through the eyes and the lens of an economist, but you've got to take these political considerations into account because they're the block, if you listen to the other panelists.
Sure. I mean, I think all of this is true. I mean, I think what Jules said is it's absolutely true. And I mean, I think an alternate way of looking of what's been said is the demand side. I mean, as long as somebody wants something, somebody's going to produce it. Very difficult if people have a demand for something for companies not to produce it, whether they're national oil companies or they're private companies. As long as the world demands 100 million barrels of oil a day, somebody's going to produce 100 million barrels of oil a day. So it's a matter of taking the right policies and the politics on to lower that demand of 100 million barrels of oil a day. And when we do that, then companies, slowly but surely, national oil companies and private companies will stop producing that oil to feed that demand. So I think, an alternate way of doing it is just not thinking about how do we cut the supply of oil, but how do we cut the demand for oil? So, I mean, I think we all agree that that's what we need to do. And it's hard and it's difficult because people are displaced. Companies need to shut down, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I agree with you. It is hard.
But is it too much of a demand, though, Jose Antonio, on certain parts of the world that perhaps are only just experiencing prosperity or a burgeoning middle class to ask them to make those sorts of choices?
No, I'm sorry to insist that I don't believe...
No, you insist away.
That I don't believe in this, this choice between growth and clean energies. I mean, we've talked about all the issues that all the renewable costs have come down, especially in the last few years. Jules and Laurence and everybody has talked about investing in the fossil fuel plants of today are stranded assets tomorrow. Well, countries that need to grow can avoid and they can leapfrog investing in these types of plants because the alternative is profitable and it can provide the energy we need. So I don't believe in this dichotomy of growth versus versus fossil fuels or being clean growth. I really don't.
Jules?
Yeah, can I build on that? Because I think it is a fundamental point. If you're the government of Vietnam or the government of Pakistan or the government of Kenya, and because maybe you're on the Belt and Road, the Chinese government offers to build you a coal plant, and it comes with some financing. And you're going to think about it, and you realize, oh golly, I don't have domestic supplies of coal. The cost of this plant is now more than the renewables alternatives. That's the investment of the future. And I'm already dealing with a pollution issue in my cities anyway. The choice seems so obvious. So how do we make sure that decision makers around the world understand this fundamental shift in economics that has taken place, and then make sensible economic decisions that also benefit their citizens?
Right, well, you answer that question, Laurence. I'll put that to you. How do you unlock it then politically in that example, picking a country like Kenya?
that, for example, it means that you cannot isolate, and that's what Omar was saying, you cannot isolate the energy system from the macroeconomic of a country and the tax resources from the government. And that's why it's so difficult, because you have to move the whole system. Sweden has, in a way, just done that transition, or is doing that transition, because they just reformed totally the tax system, and they move from the tax on labor to the tax on environment and pollution. I think that's one very important piece. The second is what Jules was referring to, access to capital for a number of countries. Kenya is a good example. India is. The cost of capital, access to capital to invest in renewable energy is still very high. And of course, the abundant resource still of Japan, for example, or it was still the case for South Korea, now decreasing, or still China, offering apparently cheap capital to build a coal power plant or to invest in gas, for example, when I think about Mozambique, for example. These are really the bad incentive. So I do think that a very important and very difficult issue is these developing countries, and I totally agree with Jose, you don't separate growth from clean energy. There is no need for that. The problem is the tax base and the incentive. And yes, the international capital markets has to offer really reasonable access for these countries to invest in which is more capital intensive in the beginning. Okay. And that's why I think export credit and investment, BRI is a good example, should really focus on clean energy and not, of course, subsidize this energy of the past.
All right, well, we're going to develop those thoughts, Laurence, in just a moment. But before we move on, a reminder that coming up later, Ethiopian Prime Minister and Nobel Peace Prize winner Abiy Ahmed will be in conversation with Bertrand Badre. Not long now, before that. Yeah, let's just pick up on that, Omran, because can the finance industry, pension funds in particular, use their enormous investing power to drive the transition to renewable energy? And what about the IMF, World Bank and other global institutions?
I think they can. I think they need to be the key driving force, because they just will make it not only more expensive to build fossil fuel, will make it more attractive, relatively speaking, to build anything clean. And I think that's happening. And not only is it happening, it's happening fast. I mean, you see, even in post-COVID, in the last 4 months, you see, ESG-related stocks performing better. You see, there was a poll made by JP Morgan where they interviewed 50 global institutions, like $13 trillion of assets, and 70% said that COVID will accelerate this. And I think, the trends are all moving towards that. And I think that you're seeing kind of several factors coming in at the same time. We talked about the balance of political and economic and technology. And I think that the finance sector will have to be the one pushing it. But it's now a much easier case to make when the technologies have caught up, the costs have come down, and the willingness is there. So I think, yes, absolutely they can, and I think they will continue to be. An interesting point related to that also is the fact that carbon pricing. We mentioned, we went back to that earlier. There was a recent group of CEOs that actually came out publicly in the Business Roundtable, 200 companies of Amazon and Chevron, recommending that a carbon price is established, and that they said they need that, and they need it for certainty. So it's become really a very different narrative and a very different situation. And really, I think that the driver has been eventually, once the finance sector made that decision, I think everything's moving faster now.
Jose
Antonio? Still a long way to go, but it will play a big role.
Jose Antonio, what's your response, particularly around carbon pricing?
Well, I mean, I think to build on what Omar said, and to put in another layer of complexity on this, I mean, one of the issues that we've had is, we know if you're going to build a plant, you give the plot of land. But issues that have come up repeatedly in emerging economies are property rights on when you're going to put a wind farm in a large piece of land. You will not believe the number of times where you have to shut down the wind farm because the property rights are not correct. And farmers or people who have claims to the land come in and say, no, you can't turn the turbines on until you do A, B, or C. And then the politics gets involved and the electricity, etc. The same thing happens with solar farms. because these things, they're not concentrated small pieces of land. They tend to be larger, which is fine. If you have a desert, you can put lots of solar panels. But if you don't have the right land property rights, that becomes an issue. So I think, as Omran said, I'm happy and I agree totally that the finance industry is having a big push. But now, especially in emerging economies, we need to take care of other stuff to make sure the investments happen profitably, because the pension funds are not going to invest in wind farms if they have property right issues. So I think it's also an interesting area that we need to work on.
Well, Laurence, the Paris Agreement you worked on predicted 25% of global emissions to be under some carbon pricing mechanism. Has that been borne out?
It's coming in a way, but the problem is that the carbon price, which is actually used, and it's used in quite a number of countries now beyond Europe, is still very low, under $20 a ton in the majority of the cases, which we should be for 2030 around 80 ton, at least in 2030, or even more by European standard, which would be at $100 a ton. So we are not there. That's evident. The resistance to the carbon price in economies, and I was referring, for example, to the French case, is that it has, for the moment, we haven't avoided to have this regressive effect on household income. Because the people, of course, who are paying for their fuel for their cars or the heating of their houses, for them, an increase in the price has much more consequences in the term of their acquisitive powers and for more wealthy level of the society. So there is a regressive element in the carbon price we have to address if we want this to be accepted by the society. And of course, we have then to invent or innovate mechanisms that on one side gives the price signals that can help the expectation and move the economy, but on the other side address the regressive impact on the income. And that's super important if we want to go further. Second, I think we should think about, it's not only about producing more energy, it's being much, much more efficient to do the same thing. And that's not a good idea, just not to have insulated house or a cooling in hot countries that really is not efficient, which is the case now. We're very inefficient cooling devices. So this is a whole effort of thinking the system right.
Jules, can I get you to respond to some of what Laurence has said, particularly about the regressive impact and how that's got to be addressed? How would you do it?
Yeah, it is a fundamental issue, and we've seen it in some ways, for example, in France with the yellow vests, which to some extent emerged because of a tax on fuel. Interestingly, here in the United States, there has been a discussion, particularly on the more conservative part of the political spectrum, of what is called a tax and dividend system, where everybody pays a carbon tax. Everybody pays carbon tax on the product that they use, but at the end of each quarter, a check is written to every citizen of the country representing the amount of carbon tax that was collected. And then you overcome that regressive nature of the tax that Laurence was describing. The alternative is to go the Swedish way, again, as Laurence was describing, where we are reducing taxes on labor and are replacing it with a tax on carbon. So there are definitely mechanisms around it, and it requires savvy policy making to find the right solution for an individual country.
And what are those sort of savvy policy making that would actually convince politicians to take those measures?
I think politicians are starting to realize that the risk associated with climate change is no longer a risk for 2, 3, 4 generations down the road. There's a risk of today, and that's driving this, right?
Laurence, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think I'm speaking for my own political environment and not for many other political cultures, so it doesn't make sense for certainly other countries like beyond Europe. But anyways, if you want to be politically savvy. You have to gain the trust of your citizen. To gain the trust of your citizen, you have been really make proofs that you really care for where they are. And it could be the center of US as well as the West Coast, not only one part of the population, but really trying to address the issues of everyone. And I deeply feel that our democracies are in the danger where people don't feel that government are really taking care of them and listening to them. The second aspect is really to have the public participating to the policy decision. I'm a fan of it. I don't think you can have only top-down decision-making. It doesn't work because it's a system change. You can't have people changing their behavior, changing their expectation and thinking about the risk of climate change and responses if you don't have them having agency. So agency of citizens for me is one of the main recipes for political savvy solutions.
Okay, I mean, Jose Antonio, you might want to respond to that, but I also want to ask you about something that's happened as a result of the pandemic, which is a huge decrease in fuel demand thanks to changes in transportation. How much of that do you think can be fed into a sort of long-term economic strategy, and is it permanent, that change and that decrease?
Well, I mean, I think just to touch on the political savviness, I think the conclusion of what both Jules and Laurent said is that it is very difficult to do these things because at the end of the day, they're taxes. And, you know, I was the Undersecretary of Taxes, and that makes you a very unpopular person. Taxes are taxes, no matter how you do them. And if you have to pay more, I agree with you, Laurent, there's an issue of trust. But all of that is easier said than done. You know, it's a lot harder to try to convince people that they have to pay more for anything. Now, to your question in particular, you know, I'm going to say something controversial, but the pandemic, which has been horrible, has done more than any carbon tax could have done. You know, they lowered the demand for fuel, for oil, 15 million barrels a day. So that's 15% within 3 or 4 months. That's not the most permanent and the most constructive way of doing it, but it's a lot. Again, I think we can make it permanent to the degree that we change the relative prices, so that we change the signals, so that we put these things so that we don't, you know, these things become permanently at a higher price. And then eventually we can try to the recovery to be slower, and we can reach this peak oil demand. And let me emphasize this. Peak oil demand is good news because it's not increasing, but it's still 100 million barrels of oil a day. That's a lot more than what the world can take in terms of climate change. The demand for oil has to come down drastically more than 100 million barrels of oil a day. And that the way to make it permanent, again, is through all the issues that we've talked about, politically or savvy policy making on all fronts, on investments, on the financial sector, on taxes. And I think we need to use all of these tools to try to make this lower demand for fuels permanent.
Okay, well, this is a good point at which to open things up to journalists and editors from around the world. And we're going to start in Kuwait. And if our questioner there could introduce themselves and then pose the question.
Thank you. Good evening from Kuwait. My question is about carbon tax. Both carbon tax and carbon border adjustments may be viable in the developed world. But how can developing countries be expected to implement these mechanisms without impairing their economic growth? In short, should the developing countries be given compensation or draw upon a fund for the same?
Omran,
thank you.
Would you answer that one first?
I could try. It's a big question. I mean, that's the biggest probably question, North versus South or whatever you want to frame it. But, you know, carbon tax adjustment, I mean, it goes back to demand point. I mean, unfortunately, for countries that are exporters are depending on oil and gas for revenue, I mean, they'll have to adjust to the demand the countries that are importing. And carbon tax adjustment, carbon border adjustments, I mean, they're eventually going to come in one form or another. I think what could be done is it could be done maybe in a progressive manner where you're introducing them in a way that incentivizes, you know, for example, lower carbon intensity sources of oil and gas, so that you're encouraging those sources, exporters, to slowly transition away or faster depending on what the need is. But I think there is a role to play, and the fact that the energy industry is interlinked. It's not, the countries that are importing also have companies that are involved there, and so on and so on. So you have to look at it holistically. It is going to be a tough adjustment. We see it coming in Europe. I mean, you see all discussions around even now methane leakage and border adjustment on oil prices, and even people like, never used to speak about these things in Saudi Arabia and so on, talking about the need to differentiate between different sources of oil, that some sources of oil are cleaner than others. So that indicates that people are responding to that, and they'll be prepared for that. But there's no other way to really say it, except there will be a financial adjustment, structural financial adjustment, and that requires, you see it now in the Gulf, you see it all over, having to just move away from all kinds of subsidies, having to lower payroll and government spending, and being more market-based. So it's going to have a knock-on effect, and it's going to be challenging for all involved.
OK, well, thank you to Raven D'Souza there from the Times Kuwait. Let's go to Mexico and our questioner there. Hello, can you introduce yourselves and which publication you're from, and then put your question?
Luis Miguel González from El Economista de México. My question is very simple and very complex. What can we do with national oil companies?
Well, who would like to take that first? Laurence? Oh, Jules, you go for it.
Yeah, I think national oil companies face exactly the same challenge as international oil companies. If they peer into the future right now, they realize that 20, 30 years from now, their business will no longer be viable, their business will be decapitalized. And the ones that are going to lead are the companies that most aggressively work on the transition. Think back to the world of mainframe computing. How many of those companies are still around? Think back to IBM in those days and how they've had to transform themselves. It's precisely the same thing. But because energy is such a fundamental part of every economy, and there's so much pride associated with national oil companies, we think it might be different there. No, it isn't. These companies have to adjust. They have to adjust incredibly fast. And my money is on those companies that start that transition now. And that is incredibly hard. It's going to require bold leadership from companies like Pemex and others to move towards the future.
Well, I saw you raise your eyebrows there. We couldn't move on, Jose Antonio, without putting this to you, as you used to run Pemex. So what's your response?
Well, I mean, I cannot agree more with Jules. I mean, I think at the end of the day, both national oil companies and international oil companies are going to be facing the same issues. The politics are different, but the end result is going to have to be the same. And like Jules, I agree. Those that can transform themselves and make themselves more efficient and transition faster, those are the ones that will do better. So yes, I completely agree.
OK, well, we'll say goodbye to Luis there in Mexico, and let's go to Nigeria, where our questioner is waiting. Please introduce yourselves and put your question to the panel.
Thank you for having me. My name is Philip Isakwa. I am the executive editor of Business AM, the economic and financial partner for Project Syndicate here in Nigeria. My question is this. African economies, being largely commodity dependent, have been hard hit by COVID-19. The investment environment has thus been skewed by this COVID-19. Are there ways these economies can realign themselves to attract and drive the investment required to scale up renewable energy adoption?
Thank you for your question. Anybody burning to answer it before I choose someone from the panel?
I can try. I do think there is choices for the international capital market, the development financial institution of this world, to make a really clear decision on what kind of transition they would like to engage themselves with developing countries who need now this capital. And you can have very different decisions. And I think what I see, and I would like to push for, is that a number of these institutions, let's say the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, the African Development Bank and others, they have really to provide the resources at a reasonable cost again, and in a way address the debt issue which is mounting even in your country, just to say, look, we invest with you in the right move, in the renewable energy, for example, or energy efficiency, or diversifying the economy, because the problem of dependency on one source, in particular oil, is super dangerous. And you know, of course, all the inflationary effect, etc. We know all this. So it's a golden opportunity to diversify. But then the capital market, in particular the public sector, and the development bank has to respond. And I think that's the moment to really ask for consistency between what they do and the commitment for Paris Agreement, for the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a moment where they have to be consistent and respond to the demand of the governments now in developing countries.
Thank you, Philip, for your question. We're going to go to Poland, where we have a journalist standing by. Do go ahead with your question. Introduce yourself first.
Good afternoon. My name is Michał Olszewski. I represent Gazeta Wyborcza. I'm an editor and I'm responsible for Green Page. And I have a question which is particularly related to Poland because, as you probably know, Poland has broken out of the plans of the common EU policy on climate neutrality recently. So I'd like to know how do you perceive the role of Poland in European green transformation? Thank you.
Laurence, do you want to answer that first as well?
Yeah, maybe that will be probably more adequate. I see, of course, it's a question mark for the unity of having the consistency of Green Deal. And we are in full negotiation mode now between Poland in particular and the different other government and the Commission to what will be the use of the transition fund, the mechanism, and how much Poland is decided to, in a way, phase out coal. And again, I don't know, but you know better because you are living in your country and you know the inside. I see the discussion in Poland moving in a very different way. 2 years ago, I would not have expected Poland to say, maybe that's the moment we have to decide for a date of phasing out coal. So I think there are now a number of people, even in the government of Poland these days, that are pushing for electric vehicles, for example, citizens of Poland that are really willing to have a clean air. So where does these compromises would go? I don't know still, but I think a sound negotiation between the EU Commission, the other countries, offering the space, the economic space of Poland to go for a clean economy, maybe that's the moment of the discussion. And again, I'm not there, and even if I will visit your country very soon, I'm not sure, but I think the discussion has evolved enormously when I look at what to say your Minister of Economy and Finance or the Minister of Energy. So I'm hopeful, you know, and of course the coal power plant are not profitable in Poland now anymore. So and importing coal doesn't make sense either. So
Jules, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I'd like to build on Laurence's last point there. Coal is not profitable. It's not profitable anywhere around the world. Unfortunately, it's also not profitable in Poland. I've been to your country many a time and I'm incredibly fond of it. But the reality is that Poland, for the competitiveness of its economy going forward, has to move away from coal. And the reality is that the last 10 years, the writing was on the wall, and your government has failed to take that message and start that transition. So it's now 5 minutes before 12. Coal does not produce cost-effective electricity. Poland has to move, it has to move fast, and in that way position itself for future economic growth.
Jules, thank you. That's all we've got time for in terms of questions, but thank you also to the journalists and also a special thanks to all of our panellists, Jules Kortenhorst, Laurence Tubiana, Jose Antonio Gonzalez Anaya and Omran Al-Kawari. Now, before we go, last but very much not least, we're delighted to welcome Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Bertrand Badre, CEO of Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital. Bertrand, it's over to you.
Well, thank you, Joe. Mr. Prime Minister, it's a great honor and it's a privilege to have you with us today to discuss the green recovery on behalf of Project Syndicate and all the team. Many thanks for your time and making yourself available. You have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. It's a turbulent world where people are very nervous on so many fronts. And I would like you to share with us some messages that you would like to send first to two important leaders in today's world, President Donald Trump and Chairman Xi Jinping in China.
Well, our generation is experiencing historic gains and losses across the world. Technology and wealth are being generated at unprecedented pace. The environment continues to deteriorate as more and more species are driven to extinction. Let us not leave a vacuum of leadership. Let us focus on the real problems and our common denominators.
My big question for you, Mr. Prime Minister, is to what extent climate change is already felt in Ethiopia? Is climate change a short-term or long-term issue?
Well, it is definitely a long-term issue. Our Green Legacy Initiative, for example, in the initial 4 years target for planting 20 billion seedlings is aimed at engaging citizens to adopt a more hands-on approach to climate resilience and environment protection. We believe through enabling ownership of the issue at the household level in the short term, we are paving the path for sustainable engagement on long-term issues.
Can you tell us a little bit about your vision on energy? And I'd like also to know whether your vision can be exemplary for the continent, for Africa.
Generating energy from modern and sustainable sources is at the core of our development ambition. 95% of Ethiopians use biomasses for cooking and directly competing with animal feed, causing indoor pollution and related severe respiratory problems. Ethiopian women and girls in particular spend hours every day collecting and transporting firewood in back-breaking work. Our prosperity ambition builds on a record of 15 years of continuing double-digit growth. A major driver of the growth was public investment in infrastructure. In this period, access to electricity in terms of lighting increased from 27% in 2003 to 45% by 2018.
The convention on biodiversity, which was supposed to happen this year, has been delayed to next year, but biodiversity is becoming more and more an area of focus of the international community. We would be very happy to hear your view on conservation in Ethiopia. And do you expect more support from the global community to your efforts?
The Horn of Africa is one of the world's top certified biodiversity hotspots. Ethiopia is blessed with a rich set of fauna and flora reflecting its a wide spectrum of physical and climate characteristics. On the other hand, the demand for firewood, overgrazing infrastructure, population growth, and climate change are threatening our biodiversity. Role of the global community. It starts with recognizing the benefits of our conservation efforts to the region and to the world as a whole. From that would follow supporting our initiatives financially and diplomatically. So the role of development banks and multilateral bodies is indispensable.
Thank you. Talking about development banks and international financial support, I'm a man of finance. As I said, I've started an SDG fund. So far I'm focused on Latin America, but I have the intention to move to Africa and obviously to Ethiopia. As I told you in the beginning, I came to Addis last for the Financing for Development conference in 2015. It was supposed to be a big shift at that time. I'd like to have your views on what happened since. And in particular, since the beginning of the COVID crisis, it seems that the level of international support has been disappointing, to say the least. Do you expect more now? That's my first question. My second is, have you noticed real changes since 2015? And last on that topic, and sorry to group all of this, what do you think of recent finance innovation? In particular, I have in mind the new idea of debt for climate swap, where basically you connect debt restructuring to an effort or to climate benefits.
Thank you. One approach that should be avoided is subjecting many of these mega problems of our times to one approach. There is no single silver bullet suited to all these complex challenges. Aid alone or foreign direct investment alone will not advance the climate issue. We need all of them and more together. I believe our approach to the climate agenda should be one that is focused on imagining a new future and attempts to solve for justice and sustainability in social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Debt for climate swap appears promising for countries to liberate funds and redirect them to environment and climate-friendly initiatives. The DFCs should be considered as one of a menu of options weighed against the particular macroeconomic and broader development realities of each country. I am a strong supporter of innovations attempting to address evolving challenges. As painful and costly as COVID is, it has only strengthened our resolve and taught us to plan smart for an increasingly complex world. It is only a temporary disruption, not a change of direction. COVID-19 has taught us that the climate challenge has consequences that are inevitable global in effect. After all, supply chains and markets are global. We need unwavering international commitment, national policies and local measures to reduce and reverse our environmental footprint, particularly as our health systems and well-being are closely tied to the environment and sustainability. Hence, I don't necessarily view it as moving down a pile of priorities, but rather mainstreaming it within existing priorities.
Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. I hope I'll see you in Addis after COVID.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bertrand, thank you very much for that fascinating conversation. Now, that's all we have time for, except to say a huge thank you to all our guests over the past 2 days. And, of course, most of all, to you, our audience watching around the world. But don't worry, you can still keep the conversation going on social media using the hashtag #TheGreenRecovery. I've been Jo Coburn. Thank you for watching.